Hello, lower sixth, and welcome to the lesson on New Liberalism. If you're in lower sixth C, this is the lesson for Monday, the 27th of April, period 5. And if you're in lower sixth B, it's the lesson for Thursday, the 4th of, Thursday, 30th of April, period 3. In each case, it's the lesson after you've done the 30 marker. Okay, so what is New Liberalism? Well, there are two phrases of New Liberalism. One refers to a period of time in which the Liberal Party introduced a series of reforms. The reforms, not the only reforms introduced in this time, but this is New Liberalism in practice. The other meaning of New Liberalism is the actual philosophy that's behind these reforms. So if you look over what these reforms do, the School Meals Act, the Children's Act, the Old Age Pensions Act, the National Insurance Act, they are very clearly taking a very different tack towards the poor, the working class, the elderly than had gone before. And as such, they represent a deviation in liberal philosophy. So this is a change in approach as much as it's a change in actual government actions. What I would suggest you do is you write down in your books, in your notes, a few of these acts as examples. I would say 4 or 5. Could I ask that you don't do acts which correspond to the same group of society? Okay, because so for instance, those 4 all have to do with children. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to give the impression that the liberal reforms were just to do with children. We want to give the impression that they were to do with children, pensioners, pretty much diametrical opposite of children, workers, tradesmen. I don't know. You get the general idea. Get a variety. Do we need to get them all down? I don't know. Do we need to get this particular one down? What you're asking me there is what's in the exam, and the answer to that is I don't know. So just take a few moments, get as many of these down as you like, but if you're not going to write them all down, which I don't think you should, get a variety. Thank you. Okay, so the big difference between old liberalism or Gladstonian liberalism and new liberalism is their stance towards freedom. For a Gladstonian liberal, for a 19th century liberal, freedom meant freedom of the individual. The individual should be free to go about their business without interacting with the state any more than they had to, which is why the Bishop of Peterborough wanted an England free rather than an England sober. It's why the Times would rather die of cholera, or rather take their chances with cholera, than be bullied into good health. In other words, the individual make or break society, or their own society. Gladstone himself very much believed this. The spirit of self-reliance should be preserved in the minds of the masses of the people, he said. Now, this goes by many different phrases. A lot of the 19th century, from 1859 onwards, it was called self-help. Gladstone calls it self-reliance. Other people call it individualism. But philosophically, it is referred to as negative freedom. And that reason it's called negative, it doesn't mean like negative as in bad, it just means a minus. Freedom, negative freedom, is freedom from, and it is freedom from the state. Freedom from interference. Now there's a problem with negative freedom, which is, I don't know if you can hear any beeping going off in the background, but all that means is my dishwasher is finished, so hooray! However, that was a real cliffhanger, wasn't it? Because I got right to the minute when I was going to tell you about what negative freedom meant. Excitement. Anyway, I'm going to ignore the dishwasher from now on. Negative freedom, the problem with negative freedom is that it is unequally applied. are going to try this as a diagram. Here is person A, here is person B. Person A works in a factory. They are free to do very many things, okay? Person B, who works in their factory, has very limited actual freedom, okay? Because person A has got money and opportunity and contacts and land and goodness knows what else. Person B, they skip a week in the factory because they don't feel like it. They starve to death, okay? So they're not free at all. The first person is very free. The second person is not free. So person A, the factory owner, is free to work people long hours. They're free to pay poor wages. They're free to make shoddy products, etc., etc. What that meant is that person B's freedom was limited. They weren't free to go to the race course because they didn't earn enough money. They weren't free to move from the city to the countryside because they didn't have that opportunity. They weren't free to send their children to a good school and then university because they didn't have the cash. I'm aware that a lot of this example giving seems to be coming back to cash, but that's not necessarily what it's about. For the 19th century, cash opened doors, but really it's the opening of the doors, it's the opportunity that's important, not the money. So in contrast, the 19th century liberals felt that individualism was key. The 20th century liberals felt that opportunity was the key. Yes, the money provided the opportunity, but the key thing was equality of opportunity. This is positive freedom. And what this is to do with is that it's not freedom from the government, but it's freedom to do something, freedom to go to university, freedom to pick the career you want, whatever it happens to be. Because there's a philosophical argument here. If you go back to person A and person B, person A's freedom is so great that person B's freedom is limited. And the phrase I think we did last time was freedom for the wolves very often means death for the sheep. So if you give one person unlimited freedom, i.e. person A, then you're actually taking freedom away from person B. And that then opens up a whole new area of debate, which is, are you then granting person A freedom, or are you granting person A privilege? And by the 20th century, it had become apparent that most people, most philosophers in this area, felt that what 19th century liberalism was doing was it was extending the privileges of the upper class rather than increasing the freedom of the population. So the middle class benefited because opportunity was extended to them, but not everybody benefited. So it wasn't freedom, it was privilege. Okay. I hope you're following that. It isn't a philosophy course, and I've done my best to sort of introduce it now, but there we go. So it's individualism goes out and opportunity comes in. Why is this change? 5 reasons. Firstly, 19th century liberalism had not ended the problems which it was hoped it would end. There's still the problems of poverty, want, disease. I should do the beverage report, couldn't you, really? Want, ignorance, squalor, idleness, and disease, although they hadn't been identified as the 5 giant evils, were major problems which 19th century liberalism hadn't been able to solve. 19th century liberalism therefore needed to be taken in a different direction. Secondly, Germany had already started a different direction and was doing really well. Germany had national insurance, it had welfare schemes. Anything about our course at this time, it's that people are terrified of Germany. So if Germany are doing it, it's probably a good idea. So we'd better copy it before the jackbooted hordes come over and crush the English under their heels. And that is because the future of Britain is at stake. This is national efficiency. If Britain doesn't start allowing greater opportunities for those people at the bottom, Britain will perish. Hyperbole? Yes, probably, but not thought of as hyperbole at the time. The other thing or another thing which was going through the minds of people was, if the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party didn't introduce reforms, who would? The answer was some sort of socialist party. You can steal the socialists' clothes. The socialists want a different system of government. The Labour Party stand for a different system of government, some of them. Yes, there'd be welfare reforms. Yes, there'd be pensions, but there'd also be, no top hats, and there'd be the House of Lords would have gone and all the rest of it. Let's keep what we've got and just chuck them a few scraps. Introduce decent liberal reforms and you'll preserve the system. Finally, the philosophical side of things. T.H. Green, one of the key thinkers of new liberalism, argued that the state should interfere in the lives of the citizens. This was a radical departure from what liberal thinkers had said before. He said only to provide opportunities, but it needs to be done. And Hobson and Hobhouse, who were two other political thinkers at the time, said that you needed to replace the concept of the individual being free from the state to the state providing freedom for the individual. So a leveling of the playing field to an extent. Okay, so this is freedom from versus freedom to. Oh, sorry, just take a few moments, pause for 5-6 minutes to, if you've not done it already, have some kind of spider diagram for these 5 changes. Just make it a quick reference. Thank you. Okay, so negative freedom is when the state doesn't interfere, and positive freedom is when the state does interfere. But don't get carried away. For it to be positive freedom, the state only interferes to enhance freedom. Okay, if it's just a question of the state wants to get involved in the lives of the people, then that's not positive freedom. It's got to enhance freedom for it to count as positive freedom. So you look at things that they did in this time. The School Meals Act, which was on the slide a few moments ago, gives more opportunity for the youth, not just an opportunity to eat a school meal, but for many of them, it might be the only hot meal that they have. It allows them to concentrate more. That gets them better at whatever kind of education they're doing. They can go on. Old age pensions for the elderly. And the point is that they haven't had these opportunities before. The theory that the elderly were poor because they wasted all their money had been destroyed by studies like Booth and Rowntree. So the elderly were given extra opportunities to benefit here. Now, so far, all very positive. And if you remember the liberal reforms from your time in IGCSE history, when we looked at it with medicine, you'll be aware that they've got a generally sort of positive vibe about them, which is good. But don't go too far down that road. The reforms were good, but they were limited. They did not encompass everything, but they were not permissive. It wasn't a you can do this if you want. It was a you must do this. Local authorities didn't get a choice. For the vast majority of reforms, at least, they were told this is what you now have to do. And the other thing I don't want to suggest is that the liberal reforms got rid of what went before. The older way of dealing with poverty and unemployed workers was through something called a friendly society. And this was allowed to continue. Okay, the friendly societies still existed. So did charities. They did not get replaced, but they got supplemented. So as well as the friendly society, you now had national insurance. And sometimes, this is the other key thing about the liberal reforms, sometimes this did mean taxing the wealthy more money to pay for it. That's when you're talking about the 1909 budget, the war budget, which we've already looked at. However, it's often forgotten and shouldn't be that the less well off were often also told that they had to pay their way. Okay, so the National Insurance Act of 1911, which we will look at in more detail, was a compulsory system, which meant that even if you earned a very small amount of money, you had to pay national insurance. So you actually got less money in your pocket by the end of the day under the Liberal government's actions than previously. Right, thinking about new liberalism, 2 names spring to mind. I want you to pause now and see if you can guess which 2 names are most often associated with new liberalism. What I'm hoping there is that somebody walked past your door whilst you were shouting at the computer obscure names of 19th century politicians. It's Ariatus Ecus Douglas. Well, it's not. It's Churchill and Lloyd George. But we must be careful of reducing new liberalism to just two figures. It's not just Churchill and Lloyd George. They are the most well-known figures, but they are not the only ones. Why did Churchill and Lloyd George and others back new liberalism? Well, obviously there's the philosophical argument, but there might be some other factors too. Pause for a few moments. What other reasons might convince individuals to back new liberalism other than an agreement with the underlying philosophy? Okay, multiple reasons. One, perhaps, shown here. You won't get images, I don't think, as part of your essay, your exam questions, but here we go. This is called forced fellowship. A suspicious-looking party, who you'll see is carrying a club marked socialism, is sidling up to old liberalism and saying, any objection to my company, I am going your way and further. In other words, socialism, liberalism. And people did criticize Lloyd George and Churchill because it was widely held at the time. I don't think this is necessarily true, but what they were doing was they were basically adopting new liberalism for other factors. In other words, the other factors were they were trying to make political mileage out of this idea. In crude terms, they thought it would win them votes. And if it wins them votes, it makes them popular and it advances their career. These guys go on to be prime minister. Additionally, it's a way of outmaneuvering socialism. Yeah, the guy with the club won't be using the club if there's no need to use the club. If it becomes new liberalism, it's the most terrible annotation ever, he's going to see that and he's going to be happy. My God, that's frightening. Anyway, and so will liberalism. There we go. So you turn him into Joseph Chamberlain. Fire. Okay, and that ends the art lesson. I'm sure you didn't need to see that, but consider your lives enriched because of it. Okay, so in summary, it's political capital, political mileage, the advancement of their careers are outflanking socialism. New liberalism, as I said earlier, was not just a Lloyd George Churchill phenomenon, and nor is it I mean, it's a different liberalism, but it's still noticeably liberalism. It's very obviously liberalism. It is not something which replaces, but rather builds on top of old theories. So liberals are still free trade. They're still very much wedded to the idea of small government. There's just a recognition that government maybe has to be a bit bigger than they originally thought it was. If you're looking for the roots of new liberalism, you don't have to go to Marx or Engels. You could find it in, though it pains me to say it, Joseph Chamberlain. He did something in Birmingham, which is called gas and water socialism, but it wasn't really socialism, just liberalism. Richard Cross, William Vernon Harcourt, Thomas Paine from the other side of the course, a guy we haven't done at all from the 1800s and 1810s called John Wilkes. He's quite fun, but he falls between both courses, so we're not going to do him. And it has a lasting influence. You know, the Attlee government implements the Beveridge Report. Beveridge was involved in the drafting of the National Insurance Act. It's late in the 1970s. There's a Home Secretary, 60s and 70s Home Secretary called Roy Jenkins. He's the guy who wrote the biography of Gladstone. Really inspired by this concept of new liberalism, despite being a Labour Party politician. I think probably the best way to end this is to give you a quote from Winston Churchill about the National Insurance Act, which just goes to show that it isn't a different radical departure from liberalism. It's just a helpful step along the way. Talking about the National Insurance Act, Churchill claimed, "We have not dragged the toiler onto dry land, but what we have done is strap a life belt around them." In other words, they're providing minimal aid to keep the individuals alive, but they want to keep there that the importance of hard work. They want people to keep going. They want people to give their all. This idea that, they come over here and live on benefits was just as sort of widely believed in the 19th and early 20th centuries as it is now. And so they did try very hard to ensure that, with its emphasis on hard work and self-reliance, remained a prominent feature for all that they had to change things. Okay, I hope that's all good for you. I will speak to you again at some point in the future. You're going to love the next lesson, which you can already tell means you probably won't. Okay, bye-bye. Go and wash your hands.